Time, money,
Yeah,
resources. Like you started to talk about those things. I'm like,
yeah,
gosh, that's
yeah,
what I do in my life is it
yeah,
like we disconnect from the fact that as decision makers, we do have a portfolio called
yeah,
our life,
yes, yes.
right?
Right. So I find that there are two fundamental treatments. And again, I'm coming from a kind of business organizational perspective,
Hmm.
but I think it'll apply here. So one I call the portfolio treatment, in which you have a number of opportunities that are semi-independent.
Hmm.
And you could do some or all or any mix and match of them you want. But the other treatment I call strategic. And this is where the dominant feature is that the parts interact. People will make new strategies very incrementally. They'll like change one little knob at a time.
Hmm.
And the truth is, most of the time, the path you're on, your momentum,
Hmm.
is pretty good. If there was a small tweak you could make, you probably would have made it, more or less. I mean, not totally true, but more or less true. But the best strategies are often completely outside. You have to like look at it a different way,
Mm.
and usually that requires exploring and considering ideas that at first actually look threatening or alien or different. And most of the crazy ideas you think about won't be any good. So just start with that. But unless you really do explore them, then and give these like there's like a little baby germ of an idea, and you have to like develop it into a full strategy. What is a full combination?
Hmm.
And this principle of having to like um, accept that the baby idea needs a little time to be thought through against its multiple dimensions, I think is probably a good
Hmm.
personal principle to that idea of incrementalism. I find.
Right.
Uh,
Rather than stepping inside here, you actually go out here and go, let's look from the outside and construct
yeah.
this like construct in a different way and get some
Yes.
inspiration.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
it's so funny as you're talking about this. I think about because I have 3 kids and you have 2 kids, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we're busy lives, right?
Yeah.
And I think about how we are organizations in our
Indeed.
families and our communities and things like
Yes.
that,
Very
right?
much. Very
And
much.
I think what's so interesting is like we think about decisions about what sports or are you going to do this play or are you going to do it like
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
of that as the incremental piece, right? Like bing
hmm
bing bing. But when we kind of step back and go, okay, what kind of inspired life do we all want to have together
Yeah.
where we're creating something together, as like a bigger legacy for our lives.
Yeah.
Like sports might be in there and theater might be in there, but what's the driver is thinking in the future and going, what would what are is the experience we're looking for?
Yeah.
And
Well, I have
of
an example of
yeah.
that, a personal example. So Loretta and I had an opportunity. We were invited to go move to England, and I had lived in California and loved California, and I'd lived around the country. And um, the first thought of that was terrifying. And if you think of your life as it is, except you're in England, I mean, you almost don't know how to approach it or think about it, right? You have to move many of these levers. It's like, yeah, the life in England won't have the car and the dog, but it'll have other things. So what are the alternatives to the car and the dog and the house, right? It's going to have different, and then it's so easy to focus on the fear of the difference or the pain of the difference with that, and that's an important thing to think about, but not before you've actually created the future possibility. So in the end, it was that forward reach. The killer argument eventually, after a lot of wrangling, was that was if we thought, okay, if you start thinking about it very incrementally, this
Hmm.
move to England, and you change one thing, which is the location, and then you think about all the losses that might come, like the friends and um, the house and the dog and all these patterns you become accustomed to, and they generally show up like, well, that'll never work, or fear or concern or something like this. But the key to it is to sort of what is the whole experience, right? Which is many, many things at once. And you don't just change one incrementally, you change a lot of things simultaneously. Like, how are we going to spend our weekends? Well, maybe there's a weekend called Explore Europe. Like, wow, that would actually be kind of cool, right? We could, instead of doing weekends of whatever it was we did before, where our new weekend decision is Explore Europe. And, you sort of craft many, many of these pieces. And those, the sort of resistance, I think, and the negative attributes are certainly important to consider. But the point is, not until you've actually defined an attractive and interesting strategy. So you have to sort of wait a little bit and make sure that this baby idea, which might just show up as one little twig, which seems a little threatening, is actually developed or expressed as a real, integrated set of decisions, what I would call a strategy, right? It's so we did that, and then to the point, you can evaluate the pros and cons or different things, but in a situation like this, it was the sort of call of the future. That is, what the way we actually evaluate this, the killer argument was, in 10 years, we're going to forget all this little pain and struggle, and we'll forget about the car and whether or not we had game night on Tuesday or whatever it was, and we'll say, were we that kind of people? Did we want this in our past, or do we just want to, live in Palo Alto all our lives? And then it just became very clear that we were going to Europe, and you had to sort of, and there were a lot of things that were just totally exploratory, but that changing that path was challenging, and took a more of a strategic sort of perspective, in the sense I mean of, in contrasting to sort of a portfolio treatment, right? You've got a strategic treatment where many things change at once, versus the portfolio where it's mix and match, and I could do lots of different things and they're kind of independent, right?
Right. I have this much time, I could put a little more here and a little less there, and like that's that whole portfolio
exactly.
piece, as opposed to like, okay, we're actually going to remove that whole game board, we're going to this game board that we know nothing about.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another really interesting, well, if you want to ask more about the strategy versus profile,
no, go ahead.
We're sort of riffing on my business experience and how it might relate to individual experience. Another interesting thing I encountered that's very parallel to this is in innovation. So in innovation, you're trying to create a future that is at present actually false, right? I mean, it's an imagined future, and people use standards of, like, is that a good assumption, and can you defend it, and can you prove it? And it's just completely mistaken. It's like the standard is a standard of fiction. I am envisioning a world which does not exist today. So I'm trying to create a new product. I mean, an electric car or something, right? Or what are some common things? I'm trying to change my life in a certain way, or I'm trying to explore a new area, or be products, make a new material that has different kind of features, use UV light in a new way. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting, crazy things
I
you
even
can
think
do.
about, like, ceramic engineering was not a thing.
Right.
And when I was in college, it was like, oh, there's this new thing called ceramic engineering, and now it's a big thing, right?
Yeah.
It's not those big shifts, right?
Yeah, exactly. So somebody somewhere essentially has to write a piece of fiction that the world might be different. And you kind of have to judge this future by the standards of fiction, because you know that it's wrong, right? I mean, it wouldn't be innovation if it weren't right. In fact, you know that the particular scenario you write is actually wrong. People do, business cases where you make assumptions about numbers of market share and market size and number of people to buy and price and so on. And then they make investment choices as if that were true. And then they'll argue about whether we have the evidence to believe the assumptions. And the answer is, you don't have the evidence to believe the assumptions. The question is, are they interesting? And does it drive you forward? So this idea that you need to sort of imagine at least parts of this future before you criticize it too much, or maybe put criticisms in service of the creation, because you don't want to just have wild speculation, right? If somebody asks critical questions, like, okay, what would that mean? How would that play out? But that's, again, more like a a fictional creation process to create this possibility of the future. And again, that's probably more strategic in the sense of there are lots of little pieces that have to come together, and many of them are different at once. It's not just one thing at a time, because if it were, I probably already would have figured that out.
I
So
think
you,
though
yeah, go ahead.
you're speaking to the idea. There's two
Mm-hmm.
things I see that are going on.
Yeah,
One
yep,
is um you're actually speaking to like values, like wait, I feel like there's some noble purpose here, right? There's a thing
yeah,
here
indeed,
that I'm
indeed,
enrolled in and it doesn't exist yet. And I got to create this future. And then
right,
saying, okay, now what's the inspiring narrative to get there? Right?
indeed, indeed.
And it's actually when you can get there, that's actually what full fuels you. I find that fuels
Yeah,
me through
yeah,
fear. Because I'm like, oh wait, but I have this inspiring narrative. Like
yeah,
there's excitement. So my
yeah,
question
yes.
is is that why you do what you do? Is that why you're in decision analysis field?
Uh, because there's an inspiring narrative.
Because it
Yeah,
doesn't really exist in a huge way,
yeah,
right?
yeah. You know, I had a professor who in Stanford, Jim March. He was a professor of organizational behavior, and he was. I love this guy. He was teaching sort of how organizations actually make decisions. And one of his classes, he had us read literature,
Mhm.
Don Quixote and Othello and stuff like this, which I thought was completely crazed. But the point of Don Quixote relates for, I mean, I'm going to circle back to your question. I'm coming to your
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. No, I get it.
The point of Don Quixote is that we're tilting at windmills. We're all tilting at windmills. And that all of life can be seen as people are tilting at windmills. So so basically love the windmill you're tilting at and keep tilting at it. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the novel through this lens, is that this comic character Don Quixote changes reality for the prostitute who never thought her life was worth anything, and this Sancho Panza, right, who just was basically a bum, right, and he brings them alive because of his tilting of windmills. So you find something you can do that bumps up against something interesting, and you're so you know pick a windmill that's fun for you, right? I mean, basically that's it. This guy would end every class and every meeting. He would say, he's a professorial type. He'd say to every student, "Go do great things." That was his advice. Go do great things. And what he's talking about is go tilt at some windmills. So yes, I mean, that's back to the inspiring narrative. In the case of Don Quixote, it really is an inspiring narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is your windmill. This is my
The-
windmill too, by
It's
the
it's
way.
kind of a windmill. Yeah, exactly. And some people wonder why you're doing it. And
Yeah, like that's
only
weird.
only Don Quixote could see the windmills as dragons, right? But
Yeah.
instill that distorted reality for everybody else a little bit, and made an important contribution, right? So there are certainly some things. I hope I'm somewhat less of a comic figure most of the time. I mean, although laughing at oneself, I think, is a good skill.
You're my brother, so maybe I laugh at you more than
Yeah,
other
no, it's
people
good.
do.
It's good. Well, I was just thinking, seeing oneself as a comic figure is probably a healthy
Mhm.
attitude. That's sort of what I was thinking. But uh, yeah, so I certainly see in my profession that I notice things that I think are sort of obvious, and then I realize nobody else around me notices them. And then I realize I can kind of point these things out and help people move forward and see these things. So I think there is a way that is my narrative, or I don't know. There's some odd thing for me at this sort of complex of doing the right thing, and which is sort of traditional decision analysis, and motivating people to have the possibility of creating a future that's not the momentum of the past. I mean, this is a huge thing I've come to realize for people and for organizations. Is there's a lot of force that's going to keep you going the way you're. I mean, you'll adjust and change little incremental changes. That's all good. You're going to do really, really well at that. But when a situation calls for something where you need to make some kind of turn, it just, it brings out all the biases. For individuals, it brings out organizational dysfunctions, and it's hard to figure out a good answer, right? So it's got everything there. It's an interesting, complicated problem, and when it comes together well, you can make a huge impact.
What you're talking about is like the current, like this, let's say the Snake River has a huge current, right? And we're
Yeah,
on this current, it's good, fishing's good, whatever, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
there's another river that we fork with, great. And yeah, which are we going to go up some tributary because there's something really amazing and there's another river up there? Is there
yeah.
some other
Indeed,
thing,
indeed,
right?
indeed.
And so you actually have to get out of the current
You have
to
to,
see the
yeah,
current you're in, I guess is
yeah,
what I'm
yeah,
saying, right?
exactly. Or at least send a scout out. Maybe you're a bigger boat, and you can send somebody to swim over there
Yeah,
and say, hey, the water's actually
check it
warmer
out.
over here. But if you just,
And
yeah, yeah,
you're speaking again to the beginning of the conversation about no, that
yeah,
like that scout you sent out,
yeah,
you may say no, new opportunity,
yeah,
no, next opportunity, but
yeah,
without
yeah.
that scout, you wouldn't know,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
They provided an important service.
Exactly. And I guess that's
Yeah.
part of both of these ideas, is that you've got to like dwell in a possibility,
Uh-huh.
sort of inhabit a possibility that might actually be frightening, or alien,
Mm-hmm.
long enough
Mm-hmm.
that you can actually see it for the possibility it is, without just like reacting against it. And certainly I see this all the time in strategy, or in saying no in a portfolio thing, or yeah, many places.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's also really interesting how, I mean, in an organization or a family organization,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
If we pose a question about the potential future, like we're trying to
Mm-hmm.
generate ideas, right? And we pose a
Right.
question about the future. What's interesting is sometimes it's not useful to pose that question at the dinner table and expect answers right away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like to really serve everybody,
Yeah.
it's to mull it over, like you said, the little seed of an idea,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
actually allow people to be with the question, to mull
Yes.
it over,
Yes. Yes.
and you're capturing all these different styles too, right? I'm sure you do
Indeed.
that in your work and in your family, but then you're saying, okay, then people come back and say, here's what I thought of,
Yeah.
without the static of everybody else's input.
Indeed. Indeed.
And I think that's useful. Do you find
Yeah.
that you're
Yeah.
engaging in that way
Well,
to create possibilities?
absolutely. And I even have a word for this.
Oh, nice.
Yes, I call it inquiry.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's on my version of the decision
Yep.
quality chain.
It's on the
Um,
one I use too.
yeah. So the point is that in a business context, people want an answer. I can have a meeting and we can figure it out and go, right? And that works if you're dealing with, again, variations of the momentum. But when a situation calls for, you want to consider the possibility of something new, which is
Hmm.
pretty much innovation
Hmm.
generally,
Yes.
uh, then you have to sort of live with it. So you have a question like, what is the best course of action, or what should we do here, or how do we use this new technology in the neatest way? And the idea of an inquiry is, it's not a question to be answered. It's not that like you're going to come with the answer to the question, and the conclusion of it is in the answer. It's a question you ask so that you can live it for a while,
Mm.
because it's going to change your perspective.
Hmm.
The question you ultimately answer to decide your decision, yeah, it's going to be in the same vicinity, I'm sure, but it may not literally be the same question. And so that you have a question to be lived, and indeed, when you're framing something, I think it's important to ask yourself a question that really sits with you, or makes you go, ooh, or what if, and something you really, it's a question that's worthy of mulling over, or taking time with, and really living with, and giving yourself permission to just kind of hang out with this question for a while.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny. I had somebody talk to me about choices and
Hmm.
decisions, and saying that, you know, decisions are not as expansive as choices. I was like, not in my world. um, because when you really look at a decision, yes, you're cutting things out. When you make a decision, you're cutting this out or that out. You're
Right,
choosing, right?
right,
Right. So
right.
you've created alternatives. So you're like, I'm going to do this. But when you look up a definition of a decision, it's actually posing a question, just like you said.
This idea of decisions and choice, and decisions as being a cut. And this is certainly how, um, the sort of technical definition of a
Hmm.
decision, according to Ron Howard, right?
Hmm.
And it's that. I mean, that's right. I think there's another angle to look at it, though, which is a decision is an act of commitment.
Hmm.
And think of it as, um, when we went to England, we committed to England, and you have to be like all in and not hold back. And there's a funny phenomena I have discovered when, in fact, it's even a great quote. I'm not sure I'm going to get it right. It's like it goes something like this: when you truly and completely commit, only then does the universe move to support you.
Hmm.
I have to look that up, but that's basically what it says. And the issue is, the sort of point is that if you're tentative or afraid, or um, don't really live the new thing,
Hmm.
then the new thing never like grows and develops and blooms, and you don't see those possibilities because you've always got sort of one foot in the past or the historical momentum or something like this. And so I think that's just the idea of choice as creation, or decisions as creation of a path
Hmm.
that might have a lot of novelty in it, is, I think, for me, and in the sense of innovation, both personally and also as professionally in organizations, a decision is a commitment to do something different. Usually, I mean, at least when I'm consulting, if they don't need me to consult to help them figure out to do the same thing, I guess
Right.
they need to be validated, but that's not,
Right.
I don't find that quite so interesting. And you look at innovation is very much that, right? If you're
So are
going to,
you saying that that committed action of being in that state, um, you're actually in the novel fighting the dragon that is the win, like you're actually in that future state of the narrative you created. You're not actually, and that's when the world lines up, the universe lines up for you.
well, I don't know that you have to, I wouldn't, there's a pull of the future that has to be part of it.
Hmm.
But I wouldn't say you're living in the future. You have to live in the present and navigate it. There's a wonderful book called Burn Your Boats Before Advancing, and it's leadership lessons from history. And the basic story is that when Cortez landed in the New World to go conquer the Aztecs, he burned his boats because he didn't want anybody to feel they could get back to Spain. And that force certainly propelled and motivated his team. They had to be successful. And sometimes people call this going all in. It's in modern terminology, right?
Hmm.
It's like, there's a wonderful quote by Winston Churchill to this effect. I think he says, "Until you play the game for more than you can afford to lose, you will not learn how the game is played."
Hmm.
And so this is the idea of like of a commitment, and it's an expansive idea. I mean, so a decision, you emphasize pruning away stuff,
Hmm.
which certainly has to happen. Again,
Right.
it's like which lens you want to look at. And so to quibble over decisions versus choice and which is
Right.
more expansive, which those are both in the space of down selecting, right?
Right.
And it's important. But now let's look at the lens of creation and expansion,
Yeah.
and that's a different um, perspective on what it means to make a decision or a choice.
And I would say the question, that open-ended question in
Hmm.
inquiry,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
That posing a question as a opportunity for framing a
yeah,
decision is actually expansive,
yes,
because you're calling
yeah,
people into creativity, right?
yeah, very much so. Yeah. And again, I deal with organizations, a lot of innovation and growth, and um,
Yeah, but even in your life.
Yeah, even in the life. But in this conversation, I'm realizing there's actually a lot of parallels or metaphors. It's
Hmm.
like, who are you in the matter of creating your own future?
Yes.
Are you a victim of your circumstances, or are you going to be a captain of your circumstances?
Hmm.
The circumstances are completely the same, but the way you proceed and how you experience it is utterly different, right? And uh, yeah,
Right, right. And living and getting older and getting more experience, you're like, oh
yeah,
wait, I have a choice here about how I even look at the problem,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Problem or
So
opportunity. Like,
yeah,
you'd hear that growing up, but then you're like, oh, this is what they were talking about,
yeah, yeah.
right? Your interest in framing and kind of what supports people in thinking about framing a problem, what to do if they realize they've solved the wrong problem, or
Yeah.
how to think differently.
Well, when I started studying decision analysis, the idea on framing was to have the quote right frame.
Hmm.
And that meant right people, right perspective, right process, maybe something like that.
Hmm.
And that struck me as too prescriptive. And on one hand, I was doing a lot of work with Tversky. I've been in a lot of his classes and doing a lot of
Hmm.
stuff there. And the way they think about framing, it changes the perception. So I suppose it's a version of perspective, but it's a much more, the standard of quote right didn't really make a lot of sense. And it just struck me as sort of, I don't know, in a way arrogant. Like, how do you know what's right?
Hmm.
And so I started looking into this, and I discovered a pretty interesting empirical finding, which was if you look at the beginning of a project and the deadline,
Hmm.
people start at the beginning rushing forward with whatever they think the problem may or may not be.
Hmm.
And then halfway in between, they panic and they reframe it. And you could predict when that would occur based on the deadline.
Right.
And I was an engineer, so I thought, okay, well, what if you wanted to do something different? And what I realized was that fundamentally through lots of, probably the middle, I don't know, maybe that's a fine rule of thumb, but is there a better rule of thumb? And I did a bunch of math and came up with some different rules of thumb. But I realized that the frame is much more instrumental. It's not about whether it's correct or not. It's about whether it's responsive or not, or does it take you where you need to go to resolve this question? And so I came up with the word appropriate frame, which was a big advance at the time, but now seems awfully lame in 20, 30 years later. Um, uh, but I think it's been unpacked. I think the Decision Education Center did a great step when I think they came up with the word useful frame
Hmm.
um, as a better proxy. That is, you're picking this to help you move forward. And so you look at the frame of whether it works for you or not. Does it help you move or not? And then I think with this idea in Decision 2.0 that Somik and I worked on about bringing together the head and the heart, there really are two pieces. And certainly true in organizations, probably also true in individuals. Yeah, certainly true in both. I think the dials might be a little different in different
Hmm.
situations. But this idea that of inquiry, you have to have a meaningful inquiry, or I'm just not going to be excited to solve the problem. I'm just not going to be excited to dwell in that space. And these are decisions probably more or less of creation, I guess. If you have a simple decision, what dinner to pick, whatever, it's not meaningful to start with. But the really interesting decisions are ones that might make a difference, right? And so that meaningful inquiry, because you're going to have to enter a space which is going to have strangeness and possible feelings of threat, and you're going to have reactions to things that are different or uncomfortable. And so the inquiry itself has to be meaningful. And I've certainly found that getting people to shift, I mean, like professionally in an organization, I realize in like facilitation or running meetings, this is actually the most important thing to do. And it's nobody understands what you're doing. But to get people to, whether it's a meeting or a discussion, to actually well, to commit to having an inquiry as opposed to finding an answer or whatever. Or another way of saying this is to to make it their personal purpose for at least the duration of the meeting to do whatever it is the purpose of the meeting is, as opposed to
Right.
score points or look good or or whatever else, right? That is the hardest thing.
I
And
would say even in a family setting, having it be
yes,
non-threatening and say, nope, we're just gonna be expansive right now,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, the stuff shows up to you in different ways, and it triggers all these biases. The unfamiliar
Mhm,
triggers all kinds of biases, right?
mhm,
So that's true. And then so this is very much true. And then I've sort of remapped usefulness and maybe pulling out this sort of meaningful inquiry part, and then adding this part or taking what was left,
mhm.
because the sort of instrumentality of it, like, is this a problem I can actually solve or scope correctly, or am I going to achieve this within the amount of time I actually have,
Right.
and do I have the right people involved to do that? I mean, those questions are still really critical questions, particularly in organizations where you actually have to build teams to do stuff. But I think also certainly within more personal decisions, some things you can take a long time and some things you can't, right? And so that's certainly part of the frame, and you have to be responsive to that also.
Mhm.
So those two things have come together for me.
Well, and I
Uh,
even think
yeah.
about like diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Diagnosis, and then you are building a team or you're figuring it out or you're gathering,
Right.
like there's a
Right.
whole
Right. Right.
whatever,
Right.
right?
Yeah. I think the one thing that has definitely a pretty straight line from that work was that there's a way in which you are always reframing. So there's some schools of thought that think we have to get the frame completely locked down at the beginning. And I don't think that's true. I mean, I think you need to get enough of a frame to get it moving and to create this sort of space of instrumentality where people are like leaning in. Let's find an answer to this problem. It's important. Let's do something. Let's figure it out. Let's explore. Let's tolerate things that might be a little alien for a while. I mean, all that stuff. And then the instrument, the sort of practical side of, do we have the right people and are we talking to the right folks? All that is, you got to get enough to get going. I sometimes call that commissioning.
Mhm,
Sort of get something mobilized. Commissioning probably more an organizational work, because you really have to assign people to it and so on. But
mhm.
I have found some of the best insights come from a answer or a solution that actually reframes the problem. So it's quite common that the way you're framing the problem is actually part of the reason you're stuck.
Mhm.
And so I like frames that are good enough to kind of move and, put some boundaries. But there are folks who like to argue exactly what's in, what's out. I'm like, approximate is good enough.
Mhm.
And I'm going to treat the boundaries as fuzzy anyway. I mean, if you told me it's a hard line, okay, it's a hard line for now, but, we'll see. And not
Right.
that, mostly they're right. I don't want to be
Mhm.
mistaken. I don't want to be too critical, but it's this one thing you thought was a constraint turns out not to be a constraint. And here's
Yeah, it's a
why. And here's
limiting belief. Right.
was a limiting belief.
Mhm,
Exactly. Limiting beliefs could show up, or
mhm.
um, uh, yeah, basically. And so sometimes
So,
you have to check. So the best alternatives, and I think the inspiring narrative part
uh-huh.
of coming to commitment
Mhm,
comes from a story that lets you reframe your life story.
mhm.
Let me, the initial frame, the best insights often come out of a shift in a frame, whether the frame was explicit at the beginning or not, but it's some kind of change in the
Right.
way you think. You realize that limiting belief.
And a frame is a question, like a problem you're
Well,
solving. How do you define
yeah,
frame?
yeah. Well, in the context of a decision analyst, right, it's a problem you're solving in a decision situation,
And
or
for a
more
human
broad.
being,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
human being, like, am I gonna move to Europe, to England,
Or am
right?
I going to
Right.
move to Europe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it can
yeah,
be, you know, any of
yeah,
those things.
yeah.
And um yeah, so that was point one.
Yeah, well, so okay, so that was pretty interesting, right? That
Yeah.
most good insights are in fact changes of frame. I think I've come to believe that the language of frames and motivation actually is storytelling. We tell stories to ourselves, and we use those as shortcuts
Hmm.
to process information and screen stuff out. Now, I did a bunch of work benchmarking decision making in R&D later, I must have interviewed, I don't know, 100 companies and done surveys of thousands to try to understand how decision making and R&D worked. And one of the things I realized from this work was that so in an organizational context, someone will make a decision,
Hmm.
and their decision would actually be a frame at the next level down. So there's a way in which frames are sort of fractal, certainly in organizations through business hierarchies, but I think this is also true in life.
Hmm.
You make some decisions about your location, for example, whether I live in Palo Alto or whether I live in England, right? And that starts to frame a whole bunch of things. And it's not merely the what's the right word? The physicality of your location, right? So part of our decision to move to England was framing our lives, instead of like enjoying our friends and our environment, to exploring this novel area. So there was so that decision then framed a whole bunch of subsequent choices, which we then actually took for granted. So there's this cascade. Once that first decision is made, we actually made simultaneously a controlling set of frames that guided a huge number of decisions without us ever really realizing it.
Hmm.
And so they showed up to us not like, some practical questions like, which house do we get? Where do we live? And this idea of living in a foreign place and really exploring it and appreciating it infused like everything. And I didn't actually realize that until much later, that this sort of fractal quality I'd seen in organizations, right?
Hmm.
Literally the down the hierarchy, decisions
Hmm.
frame each other. But it also turns out it sort of works in time too. It's like I set up a decision inquiry, I frame a problem, I solve it, I have a new narrative
Hmm.
and take a new course of action, which then frames e- everything else downstream, whether or not I'm explicit about it,
Hmm.
or but I can be aware of that and choiceful about how I make that
It's
future
as if
going there.
you made a decision like policy, like you made a shift
It's a
from
kind,
this lens to that lens. I put on these other
yeah,
glasses,
yeah,
and now
exactly.
this is the new policy, which is adventure or exploration, right? As opposed to it just like enjoying my community, or like you see is
Yeah,
actually a different set of values too. You like, oh, I'm going to sprinkle these values in more. Great. This is now part of
yes,
my identity of
yes,
frame and values, right? This dance.
yes. You could see it that way. I think it probably
Yeah.
did impact values a lot, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it would probably show up as values. I think of them as frames because I kind of think of them that way, but
Yeah.
I think that's
Templates.
probably right. But I think we think of decision analysts as, I mean, we're literally trained to like draw a box around something and pull it out and focus on it and analyze it and make some choices and then be done with it. And then you sort of hand it off back to the future.
Right.
And that's very powerful. I mean, it's fundamentally analysis, break something into pieces and then put
Hmm.
them back together and figure out what that means.
Hmm.
So that's great. Uh, it's also very limiting, particularly from the point of view of the frame, which flows more from one decision to the next and has way more control of those downstream decisions than you ever realize or appreciate, right? So they flow together. And I started by saying when the momentum when you want a future or you want to consider a future that might be different than the momentum of the past, that's when things get hard. Well, another
Hmm.
way of saying it is when the frames you've already got wired start to produce unsatisfactory answers,
Hmm.
then you feel dissatisfaction, right? And so that's a way of saying those frames are driving you down a momentum path, and they're exactly what has to be changed to get a path to steer somewhere else, right?
Mm.
Because you make decisions all the time. I mean, this idea that decision is a moment in time or a little box is a fiction. It's a very constructive fiction. Don't get this wrong. It's very helpful,
Hmm.
but it's fundamentally a fiction. They're much more continuous,
Hmm.
much more responsive, much more reactive to things around you, and made up of all these little fractally subparts.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think also what you're saying is whether it's your life or your business or people you're consulting with,
Yes.
that you're that actually there's a shift that's bigger than just the problem you're solving right in front of them or in front of your family or for yourself. That there's a shift in even how you pose the questions. Like
Indeed.
even the the person that's looking at the problem has shifted. Like you've gone
Yeah.
up the tributary. You're like on
Yeah.
you're on
Yeah.
a different river now,
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. You're on a different
right?
river now.
Right?
But if you ask decision analysts what they like about their career, I mean, they'll say, I
Mhm,
get to look at lots of interesting problems and things
mhm,
like that. And different people have
mhm.
different reasons. But I think one of the real common things that people love is this moment when you realize some insight that is just so powerful. You realize it has to, if you understand this insight, you can't possibly do anything other than the recommendation, right? And I think
Right.
that's another version of this sort of framing insight, that the best answers are reframing
Mhm,
of the flow of my life. They give me some new ideas. That's why the narrative is important at the end, I think, because it gives you
mhm.
that framework from which you're going to unfold all the other decisions that actually have to happen to make whatever choice you think you're
Yeah.
making valid. It's rarely a matter of writing a new policy
Mhm.
and then just make it so, right? It's just
Yeah,
life's
I think
pretty
we're
messy. It rarely happens that
oh
way.
yeah. I think we're
Yeah,
amazing storytellers too,
indeed,
right?
indeed,
The human beings are amazing storytellers and attach a
indeed.
lot of meaning to the
Indeed.
narrative.
This conversation is quite interesting. I'd never quite appreciated how a commitment connects to the frame. It's circular. It's not like the frame starts. I mean, an episode is started by the frame, but it's actually your prior commitments that have created either the new well created the new frames or the
Mhm,
problematic elements of the
mhm,
current frames, right? So it sort of
mhm.
swirls around in a way.
Yeah.
Um, before I get back to sort of decision analysis 2.0, where you're looking at more decision analysis 2.0, I think of like decision analysis has always been how do you win over people's minds? How do you make the
Mhm,
argument, right? And
mhm,
I think you have to win over the heart and the mind. So this is
mhm.
basically 2.0. How do you win over hearts and minds?
Yeah.
That's it in a nutshell, right? And so you go to commitment being the traditional interpretation of commitment was commitment to action,
Mhm,
which in an organizational context meant like mobilization, resources
yeah.
and plans and milestones. And it's all incredibly important. If you don't have that stuff, it's not going to happen, particularly in
Right.
an organization, and probably true for individuals too. If you don't create some kind of milestone or time frame for actual concrete action, it's probably not going to happen.
Mhm,
So I think that
right.
stands. But the other thing I found, again through the various research, and I think it's commonly known among decision analysts, is that people say they make a decision. We are committed to X, and it doesn't. And they even have a plan, and it doesn't happen, and they wonder why, and they think it's some kind of subterfuge or undermining. And I suppose, in a sense, that's a sort of nasty way of looking at it. But you've got to end up in a state where people intend the future outcome or the
Mhm.
future path, and this is very much a heart issue. And if they don't really want to make it happen, they'll find a way not to make it happen. Every great endeavor stumbles. I mean, every great project, everything always gets lost somewhere along the way. My son just did an Ironman in the marathon. He's a runner. So in the middle of the marathon, he's like, I'm ready to quit. I'm just done. I mean, he finished.
Yeah.
Go,
He
Ian.
was, I'm
But the
sure he was
point
great.
is that you didn't finish.
I didn't say I was going to quit.
He didn't say he was going to quit. I stand
I
corrected.
said this is the most pain I've ever been in my whole life.
He said,
I did not say
okay. So the point is, it's a great example. His point is his true intention was to complete. If his
Yeah.
true intention hadn't been to complete, that would have been a fabulous excuse to stop. And you
Yes.
see this and that's sort of what commitment means in a way, but you've got to divide it. It's the instrumentality of it, the head part of it, the milestones and the resources, and we got to get ourselves to Tulsa and all that kind of stuff, and then the true intention to do it and complete it and so on.
In humans, like I want to do this great thing, and you're like, I'm gonna, like, I have an intention. I, I might even say I'm willing to invest this into this whatever I want to do or my family
Mm-hmm.
wants to do, right?
Right, right.
And there's a couple things that happen. One is we get in the way and go, ah, man, it costs more, or there's this other piece, and then we start to beat ourselves up and be in self-judgment and like, oh, maybe we
Exactly.
should just give up.
Yeah, that's no good.
Right, right.
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that there's this whole swirl of like, Like,
Yeah.
in an organization might be like, my boss is going to give me a bad review, but in my life, at least, it's like I just gave myself a really bad review, and then
Well,
by
that's
the
much
time
more
the thing
common, right?
happens, like you go do it, and you're like, wow, that sucked, or whatever. And instead of celebrating the fact that you had this intention and you did it, and
Yeah.
you tried to be honest with yourself, and then you learn some things, and then you're like, oh my gosh, it's like more involved. Okay, I'm just committed, so I'm going to
Right.
keep moving forward,
Right.
right?
Right. Right. Well, and then maybe it breaks down and you can make a new decision. That's fine too, but it should be a real decision, not a kind of cop out. This is why I like this idea of committing to the implications,
Uh-huh.
because if the world has any complexity, you can't possibly imagine all the downstream decisions it's going to take to make it happen. I mean, you can bound them and know they're over here and maybe this big or that small. And again, decision analysis will give you a sort of roadmap to that future, which can be tremendously helpful. But you don't actually commit to the specifics of it in a way. You commit to the implications of it. So this is again, the head and heart side, right? So the milestones, resources, budgets, timelines, this kind of thing, escalation procedures if things go wrong, and then the intention side. And it's like, well, what are the implications of moving to your England? Well, there's a lot of fuss and disruption. Okay. That just sort of comes with
Passport,
territory, right? I have to be
moving
committed.
stuff.
Yeah. Packing your house, right? I mean, and you don't really realize all of this stuff at the beginning. You can realize some of it.
Yeah.
But and it's good to think about it and get yourself comfortable with it. And you also have to realize it's just, you can't think of everything. It becomes a frame that then drives all those subsequent decisions to go forward.
Mm, I
So
love it.
that's the framing bit.
The 2.0.
Framing plus decision analysis 2.0. But this is great. I hadn't really realized this sort of connection between frame and commitment, and indeed narrative as a way of changing the frame,
Yeah.
right? And giving people tools to reframe to frame a situation, a novel situation, in a new way.
Yeah.
Because our brains just seem to work that way through storytelling.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a couple things, like there's one way of looking at a decision problem in the future and going, how will I feel about this in 10 minutes, 10 days, 10
Right.
weeks,
Right.
or, that whole 10-10-10 idea. I think it's
Right.
Susie Welch that wrote that book about, like, or it could be 10 weeks, 10 months, 10 years, whatever. There's that. But then there's also the idea of backcasting. Like, if I'm living in that future and I'm here,
Right.
how did I get there?
Right. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's actually where in the inspiring narrative starts to come alive. I think 10-10-10 is more like okay, like take some of the pressure off. It's a great way to kind of calm down and go, this isn't really that big a deal,
Yeah.
even though it
Yeah.
feels like it right this moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there are times when creating the inspiring narrative helps pull you through fear and
Yeah.
self-judgment and all
Yeah.
that stuff
Yeah.
of
Well,
backcasting.
traditional decision analysis, and I will be a little unfair, but it has this possibility of not getting it right. Right? There's sort of an assumption that there's a right answer and I have to find it, and I think that's limiting, or
It's
might
a
even create
setup.
decision anxiety. Right? It's a kind of
Setup.
setup. Yeah.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you ever perfect?
Always.
Yeah. Okay. Are we ever perfect? No. Do we live into like excellence and really striving to do things in an excellent
Yes.
fashion? 100%. But perfect is like a yardstick that has no like lines on it
Yeah.
and is
No, absolutely.
infinite, right?
The idea of perfect is a
It's the same.
dangerous.
It's the
just
same as right. Like,
it's a bad
who's
idea,
right?
basically.
Who's
Yeah.
defining the yardstick
Yeah.
or the
Yeah. No,
merit badge?
I was winding up a little bit, but you're right. I think perfect is actually one of these really dangerous ideas from a psychological point of view, from a decision idea. It's paralyzing.
Yeah, and same with being right, finding the right answer. How
Yeah.
about find your right answer? Find your right answer, right?
What path do I want to choose? I mean, there's a
Mhm.
way in which a decision, go back to sort of, is it a cut? You're sort of choosing a whole path, a whole future, a whole set of things, right?
Right.
And so that has to be,
Okay,
the
so
head side is well, it does need to be in your interest. I mean, I think
yeah,
the point is, there are a lot of mistakes. You look at the cognitive biases. People do a lot of stuff that's really not in their interest, or isn't creative enough and falls way short of what they themselves would like to have, right? And so
Right.
you can live in frustration with that, or you
Right.
can try to, do better. So right maybe isn't quite the right word, but
Mhm.
I think there is an idea of finding better answers than the one you have now, and
Yeah.
and an idea of improvement on whatever dimensions you find important. But this
Right.
idea we can do better, we can find a path, or we could be reassured even that the path we're on is the right one. I mean, I
Mhm.
said maybe I don't like it when the momentum answer is the right answer, but sometimes that's actually very powerful, right? I have a lot of what ifs or nagging questions. Could I do better? And if you can settle that, then you can repack your frames and just start using them instead of questioning them all the time, right? Frames. As you move your lens up and down, those decisions become the focal points. This is the point about fractal, right? The one person's policy decision is another person's ordinary decision or strategy decision,
Right.
uh,
Or my own
or my own, indeed.
decision is actually my next frame.
Yes, yes. I
Yeah.
think these are best
Okay.
taken very seriously, but very lightly at the same time.
Yeah.
It's like,
Welcome to the collective Matheson brain right here.
exactly,
Just
right?
saying.
Yeah.
So then here's the tragedy for me
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
framing and decision making. The
Mm-hmm.
thing that's like heartbreaking is uncertainty.
Mm.
Do you just have like a few words about
Yeah,
comforting
well,
people about
let
uncertainty?
me
Give us
go
some
to
comfort.
the back to the idea of innovation and your life as invention or fiction or something
Mhm,
like that, as if you want the sort of
mhm.
personal metaphor.
Yeah.
But uh, in organizations, in innovation, people usually think uncertainty is risk,
Mhm,
meaning what's the chance or what's the mechanism that something won't turn out the way I dream or envision,
mhm,
right? And you commit to the plan, and now you've made a promise, and you're quote held accountable to achieving that promise. And so uncertainty is fundamentally, I'm going to screw up. It's really framed that way, and this is very powerful for getting stuff done. Again, this is one of these things that's got two sides. It's like on one hand, it's very powerful for getting them to commit to deadlines. And if you don't make that deadline, then you're accountable. You didn't make it, right? And it's very clear, and you know what to do. And if you got to coordinate lots of people, you have to make promises to each other and be pretty reliable at hitting them. I mean, it's all fabulous. And it creates uncertainty as fear, or its downside, maybe would be a way of saying it. Uncertainty is downside. Well, there's a whole set of uncertainties, and this is completely true in innovation, which is all upside.
mm.
And I think the thing people overlook in uncertainty is that it may work out better than you can imagine. And so one of the things, in fact, there's a wonderful cognitive biases, which if it goes wrong, we attribute it to bad luck. But if it goes right, we attribute it to our skill. This
Mhm.
is a well-known cognitive bias. But I think I find this, once you realize it's a bias, it's very freeing. It's like, suppose the upside is just luck too. Isn't that wonderful, right? I mean, then you can relax more. The downside's like the upside. Like the downside's my incompetence. The upside's my imagination, right? I mean, it's just much more freeing, I guess, to think of it this way. So I think that the word I would say about uncertainty is look for the upside. And some in organizations for sure, and many other places, this idea of a promise um, causes things to be small. So if I'm going to make a promise and you're going to punish me for not meeting it, I'm going to make a promise I'm sure I can meet, which means I am going to be incremental. I'm going to do something I'm confident in. And so if I'm trying to do something innovative or new or interesting, I'm not going to make a promise about that because I actually don't know that it can happen, right? I'm making
Mhm,
something up. It's fiction.
mhm.
But it is that tension between the fiction and the reality that propels the growth, the inquiry, right? The inquiry that gives you the potential to find it, or maybe not work out.
Mhm.
So it's that upside uncertainty, I think, is always there, and we just don't realize it. There's all these surprising, delightful things that happen. I mean, so I moved to England. I barely knew what the Netherlands was. I've discovered I love the Dutch. I mean, I didn't even know that. speaking in broad generalizations there, but there's a cultural set of assumptions in Dutch, which include things like being incredibly straightforward and direct, which is almost terrifying when you first start interacting and you're not ready for it, but turns out to be great. I really enjoy it.
There's no mystery. You just get feedback. It's clear. It's all clear.
They generally shoot it, say it like they mean it, and they don't get hung up on it. You can disagree and it's fine. It's like, I mean, I'm speaking in broad cultural
Right,
general,
of course.
but the point is that this is just an example of a cultural upside surprise from a country I, could have barely identified on a map before. And so there you go. They're everywhere, and you've got to sort of train yourself. I mean, I think in life, the life lesson here is to train yourself to see them when they happen. Like, wow, that was pretty awesome. Because if you don't reflect on them or see them when they happen to you, you don't imagine them beforehand either.
Or celebrate.
Or celebrate them, right?
Like, oh, well, got to keep plodding forward. Like, wait, did you just see what happened?
Yeah, I love this idea. I read this book about happiness. And one of the things I had in it was the gratitude journal. And the idea is to write, so you take a journal and you write down 3 things a day that you're happy about or grateful for, whatever language you want to use. Basically, these things the upside things. And the instructions were, you may be tempted to write an accurate account of what happened. Do not do this. Write down just the stuff that you're happy or delighted about or whatever words you want to do. And the point is that these things are happening all the time. And because you have a sort of fear of uncertainty or negativity about it, you don't appreciate them or see them or anticipate them or design for them or anything. And so you're basically, the point of this is to train your mind to perceive them. And I did this for several years, and it's a much happier, optimistic way of looking at things. And I think gives you a lot more power than when you're dealing with uncertain situations. I mean, I don't want to be Pollyannish. There are downside uncertainties. But don't ignore the upside ones. And it's very much part of the decision. Or back to that strategic framework idea. It's like you've got to let the idea live long enough to see the possibility of the upside, because it's not something you're accustomed to seeing, right? So
right.
And I live with that a little bit, right?
Right. And I think you're back to, you said earlier, like sometimes we go around in a state of being a victim instead of being in a state of being powerful. And that gratitude journal, like all of a sudden I drew a little line, boop, back to that part of what we were talking about, saying
indeed
it shifts you from being victim to being the great narrator,
the captain
of the ship. And sometimes we need to burn the boats.
And sometimes we need to burn the boats.
Probably. Oh my God.
I think if you get more philosophical, you're sort of always burning boats. Every year, every second, the past is burnt, right? So
and we forget that, and we keep going. I want to bring the ashes with me. You're like,
I want to bring the ashes with me. Well, maybe. You're not owed anything from the past, or it doesn't owe you any. I don't know how to put it. That's a little too philosophical.
It's really philosophical. Is there anything we missed in this interview that we really are dying to talk about?
Well, I think it's been a delightful interview, a little surprising about the connections, and we're sort of talking about framing and uncertainty and this idea that if you're gonna shift something in your life, which is what it is, if everything's working for you, you're not going to have a decision situation. It's when it breaks down or create some that you do, right? And so you are almost, as soon as you perceive a decision, you are considering that you might want a future that's not the momentum of the past. Or you want reassurance that what you're doing is good. And that is a framing problem, because we process our ordinary everyday decisions through frames, right? So you want to frame, whether it's a portfolio treatment or a strategic treatment. Probably personally, it might be more strategic treatments, right? You want to frame something that creates this inquiry that lets you live in these possibilities long enough to stand them up and see them for what they could be or what they are. Upside uncertainty, just seeing what they are. And then when you change, when your analysis part needs to have that. I mean, the analytics should lead you to some new idea, which in fact is a kind of frame shift, which you communicate to yourself or others through an inspiring narrative, which then lets you commit to the implications and intend the result, which then becomes a frame for a whole bunch of other downstream decisions that you're going to live with for a while, right? You can go back
Yeah.
on autopilot, but you don't go back on autopilot unless you actually shift that frame inside you.
The Matheson motto is
Yeah.
do and hope.
Yes, indeed.
And I feel like that's like the perfect frame
Well,
for like our lives, right?
there you go. Yeah.
Thank
All right.
you
Well,
so
great
much
talking
for
to
your
you.
time.
Yep.
It was
Thank you so
great
much.
to
Thanks
talk
for
to you.
chasing me down. And I
Yes.
look forward to, well, I don't know, causing more trouble later.